In the heart of New York City stand monuments of stone and steel, echoes of a dynasty that shaped America's idea of wealth, power, and prestige. The name Astor still lingers in grand hotels, in libraries with lion-guarded steps, and in whispered tales of society's golden age. But behind that name is a story far richer and more dramatic than marble walls or glittering chandeliers could ever tell. It begins with a poor German immigrant who stepped onto American soil with nothing but ambition and a vision. Within a single lifetime, John Jacob Astor rose from selling musical instruments and furs to becoming the wealthiest man in the nation, America's first true multimillionaire. Yet the Astor dynasty was not built on fortune alone. It was cemented in ruthless business strategies, bold land acquisitions, and an uncanny understanding of what Americans desired. Not just money, but status, recognition, and legacy. Over the generations, the Astors transformed from traders and landlords into the gatekeepers of society itself. They defined who belonged in the most exclusive ballrooms, who could ascend the ladders of social prestige, and who would forever remain outside the velvet rope of the elite. Their power was not written in laws, but in rituals, reputations, and whispers that could make or break careers and families. But the Astor's story is not only one of grandeur. It is a tale filled with rivalries, scandals, betrayals, and tragedies so dramatic they could rival a novel. From lavish Gilded Age balls to the shocking fate of John Jacob Astor IV on the Titanic, their saga captures the imagination as much today as it did over a century ago. Welcome to our channel Words of Time. In this video, we will uncover the rise, reign, and lasting legacy of the Astor family, America's original unofficial royal dynasty. John Jacob Astor's story has often been told as the perfect illustration of the American dream in its rawest and earliest form. Born in humble surroundings in Germany in the middle of the 18th century, he crossed the Atlantic Ocean with little more than determination and a vague plan. His life came to embody the possibility that a person could arrive in America with nothing and rise to extraordinary wealth through a mixture of vision, hard work, and at times ruthless ambition. His path was not simple, nor was it always honorable, but the speed and scale of his rise shocked contemporaries and left an indelible mark on American history. Astor was born in the small German village of Waldorf near Heidelberg in the year 1763. He came from modest origins. His father was a butcher, and his family lived in conditions that were far from comfortable. As a young man, Astor was not content with the limited opportunities of his birthplace. Like many ambitious Europeans of his generation, he looked to the New World as a land of possibility. America, only recently born after its revolution, promised wide open spaces, natural resources, and less rigid class boundaries than Europe. Astor decided to take his chances there, though he had very little to his name. He first traveled to England, working for a time with his older brother, who was engaged in the flute-making trade. This small connection gave Astor not only a sense of craftsmanship, but also a familiarity with commerce and export. By the time he made the journey across the Atlantic in the early 1780s, he had little wealth, but carried with him a desire to carve out a fortune in a new country. The voyage itself was long and grueling, lasting several weeks, and Astor arrived in Baltimore with almost nothing in his pocket. Astor quickly discovered that America's growing fur trade offered great opportunities for profit. The fur industry was booming because European markets, especially in France, Germany, and Britain, had a constant demand for pelts used in hats, coats, and trimmings. Beaver pelts in particular were considered highly valuable. Native American tribes often acted as the first suppliers in this chain, trading furs for manufactured goods like firearms, knives, and cloth. Traders who could secure reliable access to these furs and find routes to ship them abroad stood to make considerable profits. Astor was astute enough to see that the fur trade was not just a matter of bartering goods, but also one of logistics, finance, and control of supply chains. He began modestly, working with established merchants to gain experience. Before long, he started dealing directly with trappers and native communities, building his own small networks. He displayed a talent for negotiation and a single-minded focus on profit. Unlike many others, Astor was not content with being a middleman. He wanted to dominate the trade. Within only a few years, Astor's determination paid off. He relocated to New York City, which was emerging as a major commercial hub. From this base, he expanded his operations, exporting furs to Europe and importing manufactured goods for trade. By the mid-1790s, he had already accumulated a considerable fortune compared to what he had started with. His marriage to Sarah Todd, the daughter of a wealthy New York family, also provided both financial and social advantages. Sarah herself proved to be shrewd in business and actively contributed to Astor's success. Astor's real breakthrough came when he realized that success in the fur trade required not just trading, but control of the entire structure of the business. He began establishing direct relationships with European buyers and shipping companies, thereby reducing his dependence on intermediaries. He reinvested profits quickly, buying warehouses, ships, and land. His first major enterprise, the American Fur Company, was founded in the early 1800s. This company soon became the most powerful force in the American fur industry, eclipsing rivals through both clever strategy and aggressive tactics. Astor was not gentle in competition. He used every possible method to undermine rivals, from cutting prices to lobbying for government policies that favored his firm. He took advantage of America's westward expansion, sending trappers and traders deep into territories that had been largely untouched by European commerce. He even attempted to establish a permanent settlement and trading post on the Pacific coast at the mouth of the Columbia River, known as Astoria. Although the British later seized this outpost during the War of 1812, the attempt showed the scale of Astor's ambition. He was thinking on a continental level, seeing the fur trade as a path to controlling vast. Astor's tactics were often ruthless. He would enter into partnerships only to buy out his associates later. He pressured smaller traders out of business, and at times manipulated markets by holding back supplies to drive up prices. He was pragmatic in dealing with Native American groups, but always with the goal of extracting as much profit as possible. Critics accused him of having little regard for ethics or fairness, and many of his competitors came to despise him. Yet this ruthless streak was part of why he succeeded where others failed. By the end of the War of 1812, Astor had already secured a position as one of the wealthiest men in the United States. But he was far from finished. He realized that the fur trade, while still profitable, had limits. Animals could be overhunted, and competition from Canadian traders was intense. Astor shifted his focus toward real estate, which would prove to be an even greater source of wealth. New York City in the early 19th century was beginning a period of explosive growth. Immigration was increasing, trade was flourishing, and new neighborhoods were spreading northward from the tip of Manhattan. Astor saw before others that land in Manhattan would steadily rise in value. He began purchasing large tracts, often in areas that seemed undeveloped or even remote at the time. Instead of selling the land quickly for small profits, Astor preferred to hold it, leasing properties and waiting for values to climb. This patience and foresight made him a pioneer in real estate speculation. Astor's investments in Manhattan became legendary. He acquired property along Broadway, near Times Square, and further north in areas that were then only farmland. When New York's population boomed in the following decades, the value of his holdings skyrocketed. Unlike many merchants who tied up money in volatile trade, Astor anchored his fortune in land, which steadily appreciated. By the time he retired from the fur business in the 1820s, he had already ensured that his wealth would multiply without further risk. The speed of Astor's rise astonished his contemporaries. Within roughly 4 decades, he had gone from a poor immigrant with almost nothing to the wealthiest man in America. His fortune was estimated at several $1 million at a time when even $100,000 was considered immense wealth. By the time of his death in 1848, his estate was valued at around $20 million, making him the first true multimillionaire in American history. In modern terms, this would equal billions. Astor's life raises questions about the meaning of the American dream. On one hand, his story represents the possibility of upward mobility, of an individual using ambition, intelligence, and relentless effort to escape poverty and achieve greatness. On the other hand, his methods illustrate the darker side of capitalism, where success often depends on crushing rivals and exploiting opportunities with little regard for fairness or social responsibility. He was admired by many for his genius in business, but he was also feared and disliked by others who saw him as cold and calculating. Astor's legacy continued long after his death. His descendants inherited vast wealth, and the family name became associated with luxury, philanthropy, and influence. The Astor family would later play major roles in society, both in America and Britain, sponsoring charities, founding libraries, and maintaining a presence in high society. Yet the original fortune that sustained all this was built by one man who arrived in America with empty pockets and a fierce determination to succeed. The story of John Jacob Astor remains important because it shows both the promise and the complexity of the American dream. It demonstrates how America's openness to immigrants and entrepreneurs could allow someone to climb from obscurity to unmatched wealth. At the same time, it reveals how this climb often relied on aggressive tactics that blurred the line between ambition and exploitation. Astor's rise was shockingly fast, and it established him as America's first multimillionaire. But it also reminds us that great fortunes are seldom made without costs to others. When John Jacob Astor passed away in the year 1848, he left behind not only an immense fortune, but also a family name that was already becoming synonymous with wealth. Yet it was in the following decades, particularly during what historians call the Gilded Age, that the Astor dynasty truly became a cultural force. The Gilded Age, stretching from the years following the Civil War into the early 20th century, was marked by rapid industrial growth, colossal fortunes, and extravagant displays of prosperity. The Astors, enriched by the real estate vision of their patriarch, stood at the very center of this transformation. The family's wealth allowed them to dominate New York society in ways that extended far beyond business. They built hotels that set new standards for luxury, invested in real estate developments that reshaped the city's skyline, and established cultural institutions that endured for generations. Their wealth was not quiet or hidden. Rather, it became a kind of performance, visible in their homes, their social events, and their very presence on the streets of Manhattan. Among the family, one figure in particular, Caroline Astor, would become the ultimate gatekeeper of New York high society, dictating who belonged to the elite circle and who was excluded. The first great monument to Astor wealth in the Gilded Age was the rise of the luxury hotel. John Jacob Astor's son, William Backhouse Astor Sr., inherited the lion's share of the fortune. Unlike his father, William Sr. was not ambitious by nature. He lived relatively quietly, content to collect rents and allow his holdings to grow in value. Yet his children and grandchildren recognized that wealth could also buy prestige. One of the most important enterprises that came from the Astor name was the creation of the Astor House Hotel in New York City. Built in the 1830s, it was among the earliest luxury hotels in America. Though it predated the Gilded Age, the Astor House set the stage for the family's association with opulence and hospitality. Presidents, foreign dignitaries, and celebrities of the day stayed there, giving the Astor name a glamorous aura that extended beyond mere finance. By the time the Gilded Age was in full swing, the Astors had moved from hotels into cultural dominance. They held vast tracts of land in Manhattan, and their rental income soared as the city's population exploded. Astor properties included much of what would later become some of the most valuable neighborhoods in the world. Fifth Avenue, the iconic stretch associated with wealth and elegance, grew under the shadow of Astor ownership. The family built mansions there that rivaled European palaces, and their presence helped to establish Fifth Avenue as the address of choice for the wealthy. It was in these mansions that Caroline Astor, known simply as Mrs. Astor, ruled society. Born Caroline Schermerhorn, she married William Backhouse Astor Jr., grandson of John Jacob Astor. While her husband was a wealthy man, he was not particularly interested in social affairs. Caroline, however, was determined to wield influence not just through wealth, but through social authority. She recognized that the growing number of millionaires in New York, many of them from new money made through railroads, industry, or finance, were eager to gain acceptance among the old families. Mrs. Astor positioned herself as the arbiter of taste, the woman whose approval could confer legitimacy. Her method for maintaining control was both simple and brilliant. She limited the size of New York's high society by creating an exclusive circle known as the 400. This number was said to represent the maximum number of people who could fit into her ballroom, though in reality it was a symbolic way of declaring who was in and who was out. The 400 became the definitive list of New York's elite, and inclusion on it was a mark of social triumph. Mrs. Astor personally decided who qualified, basing her judgments not only on wealth, but also on pedigree, behavior, and connections. Families with deep colonial roots were often favored over newly rich industrialists, though in time even some of the new fortunes were admitted if they displayed the right manners and respect for tradition. The 400 gained legendary status. Newspapers reported breathlessly on who had been invited to Mrs. Astor's balls, and aspiring social climbers schemed endlessly to secure an introduction. The list was not published officially, but it was widely whispered about and eventually codified by her close ally, society chronicler Ward McAllister. Together, Mrs. Astor and McAllister made and broke reputations, deciding which families could enjoy the privileges of high society and which were condemned to remain outside the circle. For a time, their power was unrivaled, and even the richest men in America sought Mrs. Astor's approval for their wives and daughters. This reign was not without rivalries. Perhaps the most famous social conflict of the Gilded Age was between Mrs. Astor and Alva Vanderbilt. The Vanderbilts, who had made their fortune in railroads, represented the new money that Mrs. Astor initially looked down upon. Alva Vanderbilt, however, was not content to be excluded. In 1883, she threw a costume ball at her newly built mansion that was so extravagant it forced Mrs. Astor to acknowledge her. The ball was attended by more than 1,000 guests, with costumes that rivaled those of European courts. Its success effectively broke the barrier between the Astor-led old elite and the Vanderbilt-led new rich. Though Mrs. Astor never admitted defeat, the episode revealed that social power in New York was no longer the sole possession of a single family. Despite such challenges, the Astors maintained their grandeur through lavish lifestyles. Their homes were palaces filled with European art, gilded furniture, and endless servants. They traveled to Newport, Rhode Island, for the summer season, where mansions known as cottages were in fact enormous estates overlooking the sea. They hosted balls with orchestras, feasts, and glittering gowns that cost small fortunes. The public, reading about these events in newspapers, alternately admired and criticized the spectacle. For many, the Astors symbolized the peak of elegance. For others, they embodied the waste and arrogance of an age when millions of immigrants lived in poverty while the elite spent fortunes on diamonds and gowns. The family also contributed to cultural life in ways that extended beyond pure luxury. The Astor Library, founded by John Jacob Astor and expanded by his son William, became one of the great repositories of knowledge in New York. Eventually, it merged with other collections to form the New York Public Library. This act of philanthropy, though perhaps modest compared to the fortune available, reflected the Astor sense that wealth should be associated with legacy. Other members of the family supported museums, churches, and charitable institutions. Yet even these contributions were often interpreted as extensions of their desire for status. Hotels remained another arena in which the Astor name flourished. In the late 19th century, William Waldorf Astor, a descendant of John Jacob, built the Waldorf Hotel on Fifth Avenue. A family feud soon erupted when his cousin, John Jacob Astor IV, constructed the Astoria Hotel next door. The two buildings were eventually joined, creating the legendary Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which became one of the most famous luxury hotels in the world. The Waldorf Astoria was not just a place to stay. It was a social institution, hosting banquets, balls, and gatherings that defined the high life of New York. The feud that produced it revealed another side of the Astors. Their wealth gave them not only power but also conflicts, with cousins competing for prestige in the most visible ways possible. The influence of the Astors in shaping New York was therefore not only financial but also cultural. Their real estate holdings structured the city's growth, their hotels defined standards of luxury, their libraries and institutions contributed to education, and their social rituals created a template for American high society. In many ways, they turned New York into a city that rivaled European capitals in terms of glamour and sophistication. At the same time, their dominance highlights the contradictions of the Gilded Age. The Astors lived in a world of diamonds, opera boxes, and private carriages, while only a few blocks away, tenement houses crammed with immigrants lacked basic sanitation. The contrast was not lost on contemporary observers. Journalists and reformers often criticized the excesses of families like the Astors, arguing that such displays of wealth were vulgar in a society with so much poverty. Yet the fascination persisted, and the Astors remained objects of envy and admiration. When Mrs. Astor grew older, her social reign slowly waned, though her legend endured. She had established a model of society that was both exclusive and theatrical, one that gave structure to the chaos of new wealth pouring into New York. Later generations of the Astors continued to enjoy wealth, but they could never quite reproduce the authority she had wielded. By the early 20th century, the democratization of wealth and the rise of new forms of entertainment and celebrity eroded the old world of the 400. Nevertheless, during the height of the Gilded Age, the Astors' reign was unmatched, their name synonymous with grandeur and authority. Their story illustrates how wealth, when combined with careful social maneuvering, could shape not just a family's destiny, but also the culture of an entire city. From their real estate empire to their opulent hotels, from Caroline Astor's 400 to their endless balls and rivalries, the Astors defined an era in which appearances mattered as much as fortunes, and in which social acceptance could be as powerful as financial control. They were heirs to John Jacob Astor's hard-earned millions, but they transformed those millions into a spectacle of grandeur that made the Astor name immortal. The Gilded Age had given the Astors both wealth and social power, but the family's history in the late 19th and early 20th century was no longer defined only by grandeur. With great fortunes came rivalries, disputes, and scandals that often spilled into the public sphere. Newspapers, which had once reported reverently on Mrs. Astor's famous balls and her fabled 400, began to hunger for tales of drama and discord within the wealthy families that dominated American life. The Astors, partly because of their prominence and partly because of their own choices, became central to this new appetite for gossip and sensationalism. Their wealth insulated them from ruin, but it could not protect them from scandal or tragedy. Caroline Astor had succeeded in creating a social empire in New York, but as she aged, the world around her changed. The rigid boundaries of her society began to blur with the arrival of new fortunes and the spread of mass media. While she had once been able to keep unwanted individuals out of her ballroom, she could not keep the public from peering into the private affairs of her descendants. By the time her son John Jacob Astor III and his children were taking prominent roles in the family, the tone of coverage about the Astors shifted. What had once been deference turned into scrutiny, and what had once been whispered gossip found its way into bold headlines. Wealthy families in the early 20th century often found themselves caught in public disputes, but the Astors seemed especially vulnerable because of their sheer visibility. Their name was on hotels, properties, and cultural institutions. Their faces appeared in society columns, and their choices, whether marriages, divorces, or quarrels, were discussed by ordinary Americans as though they were stage plays. In a sense, the Astors helped to invent the modern idea of celebrity. They were no longer simply wealthy landlords or philanthropists. They were public figures whose lives were followed with fascination, admiration, and at times outrage. One of the most striking features of this period was the number of rivalries that erupted within the family itself. Wealth brought not only privilege but also disputes over inheritance, control of estates, and the right to use the family name. Feuds between cousins became legendary, none more so than the quarrel between William Waldorf Astor and John Jacob Astor IV. The feud began with something seemingly simple: real estate. William Waldorf Astor inherited his father's fortune and decided to construct a grand hotel on Fifth Avenue, the Waldorf Hotel. This decision offended his cousin John Jacob IV, who believed that the site was too close to his own mother's residence and disrupted her quiet life. In retaliation, John Jacob IV built his own hotel right next door, the Astoria Hotel. The rivalry eventually led to the merging of the two properties into the Waldorf Astoria, a palace of luxury that became world famous. The irony of this family feud was that both men ended up contributing to one of New York's most celebrated landmarks. Yet the bitterness between the cousins never truly healed. William Waldorf eventually left America altogether, relocating to England where he sought both refuge from family drama and the aristocratic recognition that America did not provide. He purchased an estate, involved himself in British society, and was eventually granted a peerage, becoming Viscount Astor. His departure marked one of the first great splits in the family, creating an English branch of the Astors that would play prominent roles in British politics and society for generations. While William Waldorf Astor built a new life in England, his cousin John Jacob IV remained in America and became one of the most famous members of the family, though not always for reasons that brought respect. John Jacob IV was a man of immense wealth, charm, and ambition. He controlled significant real estate holdings and maintained the family tradition of high living. But his personal life drew enormous attention, particularly his romantic entanglements. The scandal that most defined his reputation came with his second marriage. In the year 1911, John Jacob IV shocked New York society by divorcing his first wife, Ava Willing Astor, and marrying a much younger woman, Madeline Talmadge Force. Madeline was only 18 years old at the time of the marriage, while John Jacob was in his late 40s. The age difference, combined with the fact that he was one of the wealthiest men in America, ignited a firestorm of commentary. Many in society condemned the match as improper. Newspapers devoted countless columns to speculation about Madeline's motives, with some accusing her of marrying purely for wealth and status. Others focused on the humiliation of Ava, who had been an accepted figure in society and suddenly found herself discarded. Despite the controversy, the couple went ahead with the marriage, and the press could not resist following their every move. They became symbols of both fascination and scandal. For John Jacob, the marriage represented a new chapter in life, and he appeared devoted to Madeline. But the hostility they encountered in New York pushed them to spend time abroad, where scrutiny was less intense. Their story took a tragic turn only months later. In the spring of 1912, John Jacob and Caroline Astor boarded the Titanic, the new and supposedly unsinkable ocean liner, making its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. The Titanic was itself a symbol of the age, immense, luxurious, and filled with some of the richest people in the world. When it struck an iceberg on the night of April 14th, the illusion of invincibility shattered. The disaster became one of the most famous tragedies of the 20th century, and John Jacob Astor's fate aboard the ship ensured that his name would forever be tied to it. Accounts from survivors describe John Jacob helping his pregnant wife into a lifeboat. He reportedly asked if he might accompany her, explaining her condition, but was told that only women and children were being allowed. Madeline survived the sinking, but John Jacob did not. His body was later recovered from the icy waters of the North Atlantic, identified by the initials sewn into his clothing. He was one of the richest men to die in the disaster, and his death captivated the world. The Titanic tragedy was more than a personal misfortune for the Astor family. It symbolized the end of an era. For decades, the Astors had represented unshakable wealth and stability, as though their fortunes placed them above the ordinary risks of life. But the sinking of the Titanic proved that even the richest could not escape catastrophe. The image of John Jacob Astor, the great-grandson of the immigrant fur trader, dying in the freezing ocean alongside hundreds of others, carried immense symbolic weight. The media frenzy surrounding his death was extraordinary. Newspapers across America and Europe published every detail of his final moments, speculated about his last words, and described his funeral in exhaustive detail. Madeline, barely out of her teens and carrying his child, became an object of both sympathy and curiosity. Her future was debated as though it were a matter of public concern, and her every decision was reported as news. In a sense, the Titanic transformed the Astors from symbols of wealth into celebrities whose personal lives were subject to public consumption. The scandal of John Jacob IV's controversial marriage, followed by the drama of his death, cemented the family's place in popular imagination. They were no longer just landlords and hoteliers. They were characters in a narrative of love, betrayal, tragedy, and survival. This new role carried both advantages and disadvantages. On one hand, it kept the Astor name alive in a world where newer fortunes, like those of the Morgans and the Rockefellers, were rising. On the other hand, it meant that the family's privacy was forever compromised. Every quarrel, every romance, every misstep could become a public story. In the years after the Titanic, the Astors continued to experience dramas that fascinated the press. Inheritance disputes over John Jacob IV's estate made headlines. Madeline eventually remarried, further fueling gossip. Other members of the family faced scandals of their own, whether through messy divorces, questionable business decisions, or political controversies in the English branch of the family. The pattern was clear. The Astors, once symbols of sober wealth, had become part of a world where personal lives were as important to the public as financial empires. This transformation reflects the changing nature of American society in the early 20th century. The Gilded Age elite had been defined largely by money and pedigree, but the new age was increasingly shaped by media attention and celebrity culture. The Astors were among the first wealthy families to be treated not simply as powerful, but as entertaining. Their lives followed with the same fascination that would later be given to Hollywood stars. In this way, the scandals and tragedies of the Astors helped to create a model of fame that extended far beyond their own dynasty. The Titanic tragedy marked a turning point in the public story of the Astors. The death of John Jacob Astor IV, the most visible member of the family in his generation, seemed to close the chapter of their dominance in New York society. Yet the Astor legacy did not vanish with him. If anything, it evolved. The next decades would show the family turning increasingly toward philanthropy, cultural institutions, and the management of inherited wealth rather than the aggressive commercial pursuits that had defined their rise. This shift mirrored the broader transformation of the Gilded Age elite into a class that maintained prestige more through legacy and influence than through business innovation. Vincent Astor, the son born to Madeline Force Astor only a few months after his father's death aboard the Titanic, grew up with the shadow of that tragedy always present. He inherited not just an immense fortune, but also a family name weighted with both glory and controversy. For Vincent, the challenge was different from that faced by his great-grandfather John Jacob Astor, who had begun with nothing but ambition. Vincent's task was to preserve, and if possible dignify, a fortune that the public increasingly associated with extravagance, scandals, and feuds. Vincent took this task seriously. Though known for enjoying the privileges of his station, he also developed a reputation for philanthropy. He recognized that the Astor fortune could be a force for public good, and he directed much of his energy toward charitable causes. Hospitals, housing projects, and universities benefited from his contributions. The New York Public Library, which had grown out of his ancestors' original Astor Library, remained one of the most visible symbols of the family's philanthropy. Under Vincent's guidance, the Astor Foundation became an important channel for giving, and he was determined that the family name should be remembered as much for generosity as for wealth. This turn toward philanthropy reflected a broader trend among wealthy American families in the early 20th century. The Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Mellons all established foundations and funded public works. For the Astors, who had already been associated with cultural institutions for decades, philanthropy offered a way to renew their image in a changing society. The extravagance of the Gilded Age was giving way to a new ethos in which great fortunes were expected to contribute visibly to the public good. To do otherwise was to risk being condemned as selfish and outdated. The Astors gave not only money, but also land. Portions of their real estate holdings in Manhattan were sold or donated to make way for public buildings. Their contributions supported hospitals such as the Memorial Hospital for Cancer and Allied Diseases, which would later become part of the modern Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. They supported housing projects for working-class families and funded programs in education. Though they were not always as systematic or visionary as some other philanthropists, their contributions nevertheless left a mark on New York's public life that endures to this day. At the same time, the direct power of the Astors over American commerce and society began to decline. The family's wealth was increasingly tied up in trusts and estates rather than entrepreneurial ventures. They no longer dominated an industry in the way John Jacob Astor had dominated the fur trade or William Waldorf Astor had shaped Fifth Avenue real estate. Instead, their role became that of stewards of inherited wealth. This change was partly deliberate, as many of the heirs preferred lives of leisure, philanthropy, or politics rather than the cutthroat world of business. But it also reflected the new realities of 20th century America, where corporations, banks, and industrial empires overshadowed the old landlord fortunes. The English branch of the family, descended from William Waldorf Astor, also took a different path. Having settled in Britain, they integrated themselves into the aristocracy. William Waldorf was elevated to the peerage as Viscount Astor, and his descendants married into the highest ranks of British society. His son, Waldorf Astor, became a member of Parliament and was married to Nancy Astor, who made history as the first woman to take a seat in the House of Commons. The English Astors thus transformed their American wealth into political and social influence within Britain, where they remained significant figures throughout the 20th century. Their estates, such as Cliveden, became centers of political and cultural life. The American Astors, meanwhile, saw their influence gradually fade, though not without leaving landmarks that kept their name alive. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel, rebuilt in the 1930s on Park Avenue, became a symbol of luxury and elegance. It hosted presidents, kings, and celebrities, and its name entered the language as a synonym for grandeur. The hotel's reputation kept the Astor name in the public consciousness, even as the family itself withdrew from the front lines of New York society. Yet the decline of direct Astor influence was unmistakable. By the mid-20th century, newer fortunes dominated the headlines, and the Astors seemed to belong to an earlier era. Their wealth was dispersed among multiple heirs, and their once vast real estate empire was diminished by sales, taxes, and the changing nature of urban property. Some family members lived quietly, others courted minor scandals, but none commanded the kind of authority that Caroline Astor or John Jacob Astor had once wielded. Still, the Astor name retained an aura. It was attached to libraries, hospitals, and hotels. It appeared in novels, films, and plays as a shorthand for old money and grandeur. To say someone lived like an Astor was to evoke images of palatial homes, glittering parties, and inherited privilege. This cultural resonance outlived the actual power of the family. Even as their fortunes declined, their legend grew, woven into the broader mythology of the Gilded Age and its aftermath. Part of this endurance came from the sheer visibility of the Astor legacy in physical form. The New York Public Library's main building on Fifth Avenue, with its marble lions guarding the entrance, stands on land tied to the Astor contributions. The Waldorf Astoria, though eventually replaced by newer hotels, remained an icon for decades. The family name still graces streets, institutions, and neighborhoods. In England, the Astor estates continue to attract visitors interested in history and architecture. The very geography of New York City bears traces of their influence, from blocks of Manhattan, once owned by the family, to parks and buildings that carry their name. Another reason the Astor name endures is the fascination with their story as a whole. The arc from John Jacob Astor's arrival as a poor German immigrant to the vast wealth of his descendants encapsulates the drama of the American dream. Their role in defining New York society through Mrs. Astor and the 400 captures the essence of the Gilded Age. The Titanic tragedy gives the story a human dimension of loss and vulnerability. Their philanthropy demonstrates the enduring impact of wealth on public life. Taken together, the Astor saga has all the elements of a national legend, which is why it continues to be retold in books, films, and popular culture. Yet the story also raises questions about wealth, privilege, and decline. The Astors show how quickly fortunes can fade when not actively renewed. They illustrate the tension between private extravagance and public responsibility. They embody both the promise and the perils of great wealth, from the heights of influence to the quiet dissolution of power over generations. Their name has outlived their empire, but in a sense, that too is a legacy, to be remembered more for what one represents in history than for what one controls in the present. By the end of the 20th century, the Astors were no longer a dominant force in American business or society. Their wealth had been dispersed, their mansions demolished or repurposed, their social dominance replaced by new elites. But their cultural shadow remains. To this day, the name Astor evokes images of old New York, of opulence and grandeur, of both triumph and tragedy. Their contributions to public institutions continue to serve millions, while their story continues to fascinate as a window into the rise, reign, and gradual fading of one of America's most famous dynasties. The Astors embody a paradox. Their direct influence declined, their fortunes scattered, their social supremacy lost. And yet their name endures more strongly than many of the fortunes that replaced them. They remind us that wealth is fleeting, but legend has a life of its own. From libraries to hospitals, from hotels to historical landmarks, from tales of balls and scandals to the tragedy of the Titanic, the Astor legacy is woven into the fabric of both American and British history. It is a legacy of philanthropy, of fading fortunes, and of an enduring name that continues to resonate long after the empire itself has passed. By the time the Astor family's fortune had passed from the hands of its founders and most brilliant builders into those of later generations, the world around them had changed dramatically. The United States had shifted from a society dominated by landlords and traders to one shaped by industrialists, financiers, and eventually media barons. Yet, even as new families rose to power, the Astors retained something unique, a kind of symbolic authority that went beyond dollars and deeds. Their name, history, and cultural footprint gave them a stature unlike any other American family of their age. It was as though they had, without ever seeking a throne or a crown, become a type of unofficial royal family. The notion of royalty in America is a paradox in itself. The country was founded on rejecting monarchy, building instead a republic of laws, votes, and elected officials. But human societies have always been drawn to symbols of continuity, grandeur, and social order, and in the absence of an official aristocracy, certain families came to fill that space in the American imagination. The Astors, with their vast wealth, their high society rituals, their philanthropic institutions, and their personal dramas, were among the first and most enduring examples of this phenomenon. To understand why the Astors embodied this role, one must consider the ways in which they mirrored traditional royal families while also adapting those symbols to an American context. Like monarchs, they controlled immense estates and shaped the very geography of their capital city, which in their case was New York rather than London or Paris. They built palaces on Fifth Avenue and summer courts in Newport, where their gatherings became as ritualized as any gathering at Versailles or Buckingham Palace. They had a matriarch in Caroline Astor who acted as a queen of society, deciding who was allowed into her court of 400 and who was excluded. They had heirs and feuds, scandals and alliances, and even tragic tales of loss that captured public sympathy, much as royal tragedies had done for centuries in Europe. The Astors also inspired the same mix of reverence and resentment that monarchies provoke. For many, they represented aspiration, a proof that great wealth could buy not just comfort but stature and legacy. For others, they symbolized excess, privilege, and the unfairness of a society that allowed such disparities of fortune. Like royalty, they became larger than life, more symbolic than personal, and their every action was scrutinized by the press. Their grand balls, their marriages, and their scandals became part of a national narrative, followed by millions who would never meet an Astor but felt they knew their story. What gave the Astors their unique place was not only their wealth, but also the way that wealth was woven into public life. The New York Public Library, with its lion statues and marble halls, is as much a monument to the Astors as Windsor Castle is to the British royal family. Hospitals, universities, and cultural institutions bore their imprint, ensuring that their legacy would endure beyond the lifespan of any one individual. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel, itself a palace of hospitality, carried their name into the daily consciousness of ordinary Americans who might never set foot in a mansion but could imagine the elegance associated with the Astor brand. Of course, the Astors were not the only wealthy family in America, nor were they the only ones to seek lasting influence. The Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and later the Kennedys each had their moments of dominance. Yet there were differences that set the Astors apart. The Vanderbilts, though spectacularly rich, were often dismissed as nouveau riche, their fortune tied to a single man's success in railroads and dissipated within only a few generations. The Rockefellers and Carnegies turned their industrial fortunes into philanthropic empires, but they lacked the same aura of social authority in the drawing rooms of New York high society. The Morgans wielded immense financial power, but were too tied to the workings of Wall Street to be seen as cultural royalty. The Kennedys came closest, with their blend of wealth, politics, glamour, and tragedy, but their story was rooted in the mid-20th century rather than the 19th. The Astors, by contrast, had the longest tenure, the deepest integration into the very fabric of New York, and the broadest cultural resonance. Comparing the Astors to contemporary influential families further clarifies their distinctive role. Today, the notion of an unofficial royal family is often applied to the Kennedys, sometimes to the Bushes or Clintons, and occasionally to celebrity dynasties like the Kardashians. Each of these families holds or held cultural sway, but their power lies in different realms. The Kennedys combined political office with personal charisma, earning the title of America's royal family in the era of John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. The Bushes and Clintons are political dynasties, tied to electoral office rather than cultural symbolism. The Kardashians, products of the media age, wield influence through visibility and entertainment rather than through legacy or philanthropy. The Astors, by contrast, were defined by a blend of money, tradition, and symbolism that closely paralleled old-world aristocracy. They were not elected to power, nor were they stars of stage or screen. Their authority was not official but social, not constitutional but cultural. It rested on the rituals of society, the permanence of real estate, and the continuity of a family story that stretched from a poor German immigrant in the 18th century to the marble halls of New York's institutions in the 20th. The endurance of their name into modern times reveals something about the American imagination. Despite rejecting monarchy, Americans have often sought figures to embody continuity and grandeur. The Astors filled that role in their age, and their legacy continues to whisper through landmarks, cultural references, and the persistent association of their name with elegance. To visit the New York Public Library, to hear the name Waldorf Astoria, or to read of Caroline Astor's 400 is to engage with the idea of an American aristocracy that existed without titles but with every bit of ceremony. What lessons, then, can be drawn from the Astor dynasty about wealth, influence, and the American dream? First, their story demonstrates the possibility of ascent. John Jacob Astor, who arrived with nothing but ambition and a sense for opportunity, became the richest man in America within a few decades. His rise embodied the belief that America was a land where fortune could be made regardless of birth. This message, repeated endlessly in retellings of his life, has inspired generations of immigrants and entrepreneurs. Second, the Astors show that wealth alone is not enough to secure lasting influence. John Jacob's millions might have been remembered only as a financial success story had Caroline Astor not built a social empire, had the family not invested in cultural institutions, had their name not become tied to symbols of permanence like libraries and hotels. The transformation of mere money into legacy required imagination, ritual, and the careful cultivation of image. In this sense, the Astors remind us that wealth without vision is transient, but wealth coupled with cultural contribution can echo across centuries. Third, their story reveals the dangers of privilege and the inevitability of decline. Later generations of Astors did not always share the drive of their patriarch, and as their fortunes spread among heirs and as new fortunes arose, their direct power diminished. No dynasty can remain forever at the top in a dynamic society like America's. The decline of the Astors as active leaders in commerce and society illustrates the truth that every fortune, no matter how vast, faces erosion without renewal. Their story is a cautionary tale about assuming permanence in a world defined by change. Fourth, the Astors illustrate the complexity of public perception. They were admired for their philanthropy and grandeur, but they were also criticized for their extravagance and scandals. They were respected as benefactors, but they were also consumed as gossip, their private lives dissected in newspapers. In this, they were early forerunners of modern celebrity culture, where the boundary between admiration and condemnation is always thin. Their experience suggests that wealth and fame inevitably bring scrutiny, and that influence is as much about narrative as about numbers in a bank account. Finally, the Astors embody the paradox of the American dream itself. The dream promises that anyone can rise from humble beginnings to great wealth, and John Jacob Astor proved that possible. Yet his descendants also showed the fragility of such fortunes, the ease with which privilege can become entitlement, and the way that the pursuit of status can consume as much energy as the pursuit of wealth. Their story is both an inspiration and a warning, that dreams can come true, but that they come with responsibilities and risks. As we look back on the Astor dynasty today, what remains is not their fortune, much of which has been dispersed, nor their dominance of society, which has long since passed. What remains is their legend, their imprint on the city of New York, their role in shaping the rituals of American high society, and their symbolic status as the closest thing America has ever had to royalty. They did not rule, but they reigned. They did not hold crowns, but they held influence. Their empire was not political, but cultural. To speak of the Astors is to speak of marble libraries and glittering ballrooms, of social lists and tragic shipwrecks, of grandeur and decline. It is to recognize that in a republic that rejects kings, there is still a hunger for families that embody permanence and ceremony. The Astors, more than any other family of their age, filled that role. And though their fortune has faded, their name continues to resonate, a reminder of both the heights that ambition can reach and the transience that shadows all human achievement. The Astor dynasty teaches us that wealth can build empires, philanthropy can shape public life, and image can create a kind of royalty even without thrones or titles. They remind us that the American dream is not only about making money, but about leaving a mark, and that true legacy lies not in possessions, but in the stories a family leaves behind. The Astors left behind a story so rich, so layered with triumph and tragedy, that it continues to define how we imagine wealth and influence in America. That is why, even today, when new dynasties rise and new fortunes capture attention, the Astors remain the archetype, the original American royal family, their legend enduring long after their power has passed.